In order to get some extra mileage out of the reading I've been doing, we're going to take a quick look at Adolf Hitler's alleged mysticism. Perhaps you might call this History Channel Hitler, whose Nazi party conducted occult rituals, consorted with extra-dimensional aliens, and developed technology far beyond the capabilities of even modern societies. So today we're going to look at the occult stuff. While it is absolutely true that some elements of the Nazi Party, in particular Alfred Rosenberg and Heinrich Himmler, had interests in pre-Christian European esotericism, Hitler himself was strongly a materialist and not inclined towards the supernatural. At the end of the chapter discussing whether or not Hitler was an opponent of modernity, a short interlude is given on mysticism. One of the citations is of a speech at the Culture Conference of the Reichsparteitag in 1938, where Hitler describes National Socialism as a, quote, cool set of teachings of reality of the most sharply scientific insights and their mental formation. By our having unlocked and continuing to unlock the heart of our nation for these teachings, we do not wish to fill it with a mysticism which lies outside the reasons and objectives of our teachings. In its organization, National Socialism is probably first and foremost a popular movement, but under no circumstances is it a cult. Because National Socialism is not a cultic movement, but a national political doctrine which has developed solely out of racial discoveries. In its intention, there is no mystic cult, but instead the care and leadership of the nation as defined by blood. Therefore, we have no cult rooms, but only meeting halls for the people. No cult areas, but only assembly and parade areas. We have no sacred groves, but sports arenas and playgrounds. And the hallmark of our meeting halls is not the mystic darkness of a cult room, but the brightness and light of an auditorium or hall, which is as beautiful as it is useful. Therefore, no cultic ceremonies take place in them, but only rallies by the people of the kind we have learned to hold during the course of a long struggle, are therefore familiar with, and want to preserve for ourselves in this way. Therefore, the movement must not tolerate mystically inclined occult investigators of the hereafter sneaking in. They are not National Socialists, but something else entirely, and in any case something that has nothing to do with us. At the head of our program does not stand some mysterious presentiment, but clear understanding and therefore open confession. There was an age in which semi-darkness was the precondition for the effectiveness of certain teachings, and today there is an age in which light is the basic foundation for our successful actions. But woe be it when, because of the insidious insertion of unclear mystical elements, the movement or the state itself gives unclear assignments. There is already a danger in giving some sort of order for a so-called cult place, because this already creates the necessity of inventing so-called cult games and cult rites for later on, which have nothing to do with National Socialism. Our cult is solely care for the natural, and therefore that which is divinely willed." End quote. As we can see, Hitler viewed his movement as being justified through scientific and rational means, the very methods we associate with the Enlightenment. Although determining whether or not Hitler was an atheist is very difficult, he at the very least does not attribute his actions as being the result of a supernatural understanding of reality, but a natural one. He even went as far to say that mystical notions damage the party by introducing uncertainty into the movement. Hitler also commented more explicitly on the relationship between science and religion. On October 14, 1941, he said, quote, "Science will be the victor," end quote, and, quote, "A movement such as ours should never let itself be drawn into this metaphysical field of totally uncontrolled thought processes. It has to stay in the field of an exact science. The party should not be a substitute for the church. Its job is of a scientific methodical nature," end quote. As we can see here, Hitler did not view his movement as being in competition with the church, but operating on another level entirely, and within its own material domain, it was superior to the church in its findings. Hitler also said on October 24, 1941, quote, "When we read polemical treatises from the French 17th or 18th century, or the conversations between Frederick II and Voltaire, then we have to be ashamed of the low level of our meager contemporary insight." End quote. As the book notes, this comment is particularly interesting because Hitler positively associates his movement with prominent Enlightenment philosophers and leaders, viewing their work as of greater quality than his own contemporary products. Hitler also polemicized against the church more directly on February 20th and 21st, 1942. Quote, "These clerics, all I need is to see such a black inferiority come walking by. The brain was given to man to think with, and when he then wants to think, such a black grubby little bug goes and burns him at the stake. I can see the building before me, classical, as beautiful as anything, the astronomical observatory on the Postling Hill in Linz. The temple of idolatry already there I will remove, and put this up there instead. In future, every Sunday, tens of thousands of people will go through and all be entranced by the vastness of the universe. As an inscription I can imagine only this: the skies praise the honor of the eternal. With this we will educate the people to a religion, but an anti-cleric one. We educate them to be humble." End quote. Further, he said, quote, "A single small telescope in a village and a world has been broken through. We have to break away from the concept with which the cleric operates, that knowledge changes with time while belief stays the same. Oh, how has knowledge changed, but the belief of the church has stayed the same." End quote. As we can see, Hitler detested the operations of the church and sought to replace many of its shrines and practices with his own naturalistic ones, observatories or other structures of materialistic education. In addition to a general anti-mystical attitude, we can gather that Hitler was also no friend of the church. Hitler also noted on April 11th, 1942, when speaking of Alfred Rosenberg's book, The Myth of the 20th Century, that he had, quote, "expressly refused at the time to give this book the character of a party dogma, because its title was already false. Because you could not say that you wanted to set the myth of the 20th century, in other words, something mythical, against the spirit of the 19th century. But as a National Socialist, you have to say that you were setting the faith and knowledge of the 20th century against the myth of the 19th century." End quote. Hitler also commented on his own SS and how it was being run by his lieutenant, Heinrich Himmler, according to Albert Speer. Speer writes that Hitler said, quote, "What nonsense, now we are finally at the point of entering into an age that has left all mysticism behind it, and now he is starting off at the beginning again. We might just as well have stayed with the church. It at least has tradition. To think that I might one day be elevated to become an SS saint. Just imagine that. I would turn over in my grave." End quote. Speer also reported that Goebbels opposed this mysticism and regarded it as nonsense. Hitler also defined the relationship of science to his Weltanschauung on May 26, 1944. A Weltanschauung is basically a grandiose idea that defined one's life in the world as an overriding way of being. Quote, "Weltanschauung is nothing more than a way of looking at all the problems of existence, according to scientific discoveries, such as those we are offered today. This means I assess the problems of life in such a way as scientific discoveries permit today. Whether this is then an eternal truth we can leave aside for the moment, but there was a time when man was so well developed in his ability to observe that he first recognized that the lights in the firmament had been moving lights, and he was now convinced that everything stood still, his earth stood still, which in antiquity had already been recognized by the Greeks as being a sphere, and that these lights were moving, which meant that the earth is the center of the world. This Ptolemaic system was a Weltanschauung. It was wrong, but for mankind it was an infinite advance compared to the primitive, stupid way of looking at things, of, let us say, a tribe of Negroes. One day, or in the course of the centuries, a new, better scientific discovery comes along, and this whole Ptolemaic system of an Aristotle is overthrown in the end, and in its place steps the discovery of a Copernicus. A new view of the world opens up. In other words, scientific knowledge changes. The only thing that is important is to take the newest scientific knowledge to heart and to look at the problems of life based on this. In other words, a view of everything that transpires around us from the vantage of the newest scientific discoveries." End quote. Hitler was a believer in human progress, the idea that over time humans discover through reason new facts that add positively to our understanding of reality and our behavior. Hitler built his Weltanschauung on the basis of empirical observation and the scientific principles of the Enlightenment. Whether or not he was correct in his understanding is another matter entirely, but the important thing to understand is that he was fundamentally informed not by mystical theories, but of a material theory of reality. Although some notable Nazis were mystically inclined, this was a characteristic particular to them, and not of the party doctrine itself, much less Hitler. It should now be clear to the viewer of this video that, to the degree that National Socialism was Hitler's own philosophy, it was antithetical in the same degree to all mystical thought. Although Hitler was happy to use such elements when politically expedient, these were merely cosmetic accommodations and not fundamental to his Weltanschauung.